The Matt Mercer Effect. Is it real, and if so, to what extent? How much of a problem is it at our day-to-day tables, and if it is one, what can we do about it? This is the conversation I had with two awesome creators, Wolf the Banished and Only Crits. Now, I do feel like this conversation was a little more prevalent a year or so ago, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's still a serious concern. And with some of these bigger names moving on from D&D, what does that mean for it going forward? Let me know in the comments how you feel about it, or if you've ever seen it or encountered it at your tables. And enjoy the show.
You're an amazing shooter. You said about 3 words and then bang, it worked. That was incredible. I don't know how you managed to do that. That was a hell of a skill.
Everybody, John, before we start,
a fear, it is a fear of mine that I have noticed in the last sort of 18 months. I've noticed in the community with Dungeons and Dragons as a whole, and as Sloan said, that he's referred to as the Matt Mercer effect. Now, as I have sort of briefly explained before, this is not a dig at him and the guys at Critical Role doing 20. What they've done for the community has been nothing short of, groundbreaking, for lack of a better example. They've done such wonderful things for it. The exposure, the bringing in new players, all that sort of jazz has been wonderful. However, and this is I don't know if this is a personal feeling of mine or if I'm just jealous or perhaps I'm missing the point or whatever you want to call it, but I don't like how it's been centralized. So, and what I mean by that is, like the great example is the "How do you want to do this?" Right? It's a fantastic catchphrase. It's straight to the point, and everyone knows it. But I've seen countless DMs now, all across the world, all over social media and whatnot, and just about every single one of them I care to recall uses the "How do you want to do this?" catchphrase, right? And there's nothing wrong with that, but it just makes me think that, is that what they really want to do? Now, again, great catchphrase and all that sort of thing, but it now to me seems like it's the only thing people feel they have to say. Like it's the only way to get across that you've defeated this creature or whatever the thing may be. And I find that a bit of a shame. And again, it's a great catchphrase to use, but there's a lack of originality of it, and I'm wondering if Critical Role in particular has made it so people believe, especially new players, believe that this is the only way to get this across. They're too afraid to put their own spin on it. Kind of like, if I don't do what Matt Mercer does, I'm a bad DM, or I'm doing it wrong, or I'm not doing it the way it should be done or would be done. And I find that again, and not that I intend to waffle on too much, but I'm quite passionate about this. I find it again in terms of, especially do a lot of homebrew rules that me and Sloan were discussing, certain homebrew rules that are made very popular by the big boys, as it were, and to such an extent that I've had new players challenge me on the rules, and I'm happy to discuss any ruling with anyone at any time. But to insist that, and I can't give you an exact example, but I think we were talking about the bonus.
Oh, I can. Yep.
Yeah, there we go. Thank you. That's it's a great homebrew rule. It's fantastic. No questions with that. But I got into a bit of an argument's too strong. A debate with a new player who was insisting that is the actual rule, and so much so that we had to pause the game, and I had to.
What was this ruling?
The ruling is as you know, a health potion is an action to use, and then you roll the dice to see what hit points you get back.
Right.
The homebrew rule that they use, and we certainly use, is essentially, if you want to get the whole effect of a health potion, if you want to use an action to do so, then you get the full health points back, like 2d4 plus 4, whatever it is. If you want to use it as a bonus action, that's fine, but then you have to roll to see how much hit points you get back. And in my mind,
that's a very, very common homebrew rule. Yeah,
absolutely. It's a very common homebrew rule, and it works well in my mind, because if you're in mid-combat, you pull out a potion and you carefully 6 seconds drink that potion, you should get all of that potion. Whereas if you're hastily chucking it down, you're going to spill some, whatever, hence the rolling. Point I'm making is the gentleman in question insisted that was the actual rule, so much so I had to pause the game, bring out the DMG or the PHB, whichever the rulings is, probably in both, and show him. Now, I don't mind debating a rule with anyone, but when, and this sounds really arrogant, when I know I'm correct with that sort of thing,
and when you're the DM and it doesn't matter.
There is like, try and err away from that, but you would, for a guy, I've played probably a good couple of 1,000 hours of the game, more than this particular gentleman had. Not that I know better, but anyway.
Well, there's something to be said for experience.
Yeah,
and there's something to be said for being the DM and playing the game in a space where we have to know the rules and where players typically are consuming the rules from whatever medias they get to. So I'm with you so far.
Yeah.
So here's kind of my take on it. One, for 3 years I ran it like that was a fact because I was that guy. And everybody I played with and everybody I was introducing to the table was getting it through me, so they thought it was fact. I think that we absolutely see it happening with homebrew rules and just the way the game is played. If you think, I know Critical Role in the first one, but it was definitely the biggest one, and I think it's most people's first time seeing the game. So before any of that has happened, mostly what you got was people, their idea of how to play the game came from a table, which came from a table, which came from one guy's interpretation. Oh man, I cannot wait until we're all on the other website.
Definitely. We waited for you to get back in here.
Yeah.
Apologies.
No, you're all good.
What happened there?
You're fine. But no, I think there's absolutely this arc of now that people have a visual representation of how it's played, you're going to get a lot more uniform play styles at the beginning. And I think the effect when it gets that specific can be a bit of an issue, but you will see it, especially like personally or with the people I know. There is this absolute arc, and it's really with anything. Anytime we start to be creative or try a new hobby, we are just imitating. And it doesn't matter if you're doing music or running D&D or writing, you are doing a cheap impression of somebody else. And I have seen this same thing where like for the first 6 months, year, 2 years, I'm watching this person like learn to DM and I'm like, oh, you're just impersonating Mercer. Or even lately in the last couple years, like you're just Mulligan. And then it starts to break. Usually around the same time they try and run their first thing that's not traditional fantasy. Like after 2 years when they're like, all right, let's do Cowboys in Space with 5e. And I'm like, oh, you're starting to become your own person. I'm very happy for you. And that is when they start to like dive and find themselves. So I do absolutely, it's not even an opinion, it exists, this kind of arc of Mercer impersonation or just the things we see impersonation, but I feel like it has now become a natural part of the growth of becoming a DM, and I think most people eventually get past it.
I think it would also be something that we could look at from a little bit of a zoomed out perspective. In basically every game we play, right, we always try and emulate whatever kind of media we are consuming. So, for example, if you've never played Super Mario Bros., but all you have watched people play is people doing speed runs, you are going to emulate speed runs as your first run at it. And so for most people that play D&D, our first experience with D&D is sitting at a table, right? We're sitting at a table with our friends, and the only thing that we have had to tell us how to play is those friends at the table or some kind of a media. And of course, the most common media there is going to be the Critical Role, Dimension 20, the professionals, right? And so we're emulating that, and most of us haven't read the rules. I for my first, I think, 3 years of playing the game, I didn't read the player handbook. I never asked for it. I was just like, hey, Dungeon Master, what can I do on my turn? And they would explain what my options were. I'd be like, hey, I want to try and scale this building. Okay, we'll make this check, right? But I had never actually read the material that gave me the rules. And so when we're playing this game in this kind of emulation that is the epitome of it is I am emulating somebody else's gameplay. I think this Mercer effect is very, very real, and people don't start questioning it until they either start reading the content for themselves because they're trying to become a dungeon master, or they're trying to get better at it, or they're trying to branch out, like Sloan just said, with doing some of their own homebrew that there isn't a format for yet, or they get the wherewithal to say, okay, I'm going to go ahead and read the rules, because there is so much homebrew like that. And I personally, I'm a rules lawyer. I don't like playing games if I don't know what the rules are. And so I took time when I started becoming a dungeon master to say, okay, what are the actual rules? What is it that we're doing that is outside of the rules, and that kind of a thing, right? And a lot of those rules I will establish with my players as we play the game. So one example is my group that started playing last year. It was all of their first games. We played it that AC does not hit. So if you hit somebody at AC, it is not a hit, right?
Okay.
Ooh, you
Now,
get shit thrown at you at my table.
I know. I'm sure. Right? Now, that was their first time playing. And as a dungeon master, I was thinking, okay, I can always make something bigger, right? I can always give more advantage. I can always give somebody a familiar to give them advantage. I can make a rogue that has, some kind of a mage hand to give them advantage so that they have a better chance at hitting. I can scale it up. But because they were new, I wanted to do that for them. Now they're in their second campaign, and I've redacted that, and I said, hey, we're flipping it the other way around. AC now hits. But that, in the Dungeon Master Guide, is explicit, but we as Dungeon Masters get to make those choices, and I think in the very beginning, we emulate Mercer because it's all we know. And for a lot of Dungeon Masters, even in my conversations with other people here on TikTok, they haven't read the rules. They have not cracked open the rule books to see what is and isn't about the game. They're simply emulating the other Dungeon Master that they have seen. So if a ruling is ruled in a certain way, they'll take that as a fact and say, okay, I'm going to tuck that in my brain. An action means you get all of the hit die, and a bonus action means you have to roll for it, even though that's not established by the actual game itself. And that's just a normal kind of progression, I think, like Sloan is saying. And I think that's part of the reason a lot of us are making content is because we want to try and adjust the community. I mean, that's what I do.
100%.
I see what you're saying. You make a very good point, and I suppose I keep using the word problem because I don't have the vocabulary to express a different word with it. My problem with it is if you read I have the Advanced Dungeon Master's Guide from 1979, and there's a wonderful paragraph at the front of that. I'm not going to quote it to you, but Gary Gygax himself essentially says that all these rules are guidelines.
Yes.
Anything that's written, they're all guidelines. And to me, that really, really stood out because as long as you're making a rule for your table that suits, like you say, with your armor class rule there, right? Okay, that suits your table, your scenario, your players at that time. Fantastic, right? It's not something I've ever done, and probably nor would I ever do. But that's your rule. That works for you. Perfect, fantastic. That's the best thing. What I don't like about is the Matt Mercer effect. It's not what they've done, but what's happened is when you get now people arguing about it's taking away that freedom of expression to change the rules, to edit the rules, to get rid of some rules, to add in some of your own. When you have something like that and everyone's emulating Matt Mercer, again, it really sounds like picking him out. I'm not. But when everyone's emulating him, it again centralizes the entire community's game down to a line where it's either it has to be done this way or it's wrong. And as far as I'm aware, and I'm pretty sure I can find you a quote somewhere in there, with Dungeons & Dragons, you can't be wrong. As long as you are playing the game together with your pals, with whoever it may be, you're winning. You've won. That
100%.
is the core of it. And I don't like how it takes away freedom of expression. I think it takes away originality, and I think it takes away from anyone potentially wanting to start, especially to DM, to run the game. Now, like Sloan was saying, your experience of Dungeons & Dragons is going to vastly depend on whoever your Dungeon Master is, their level of experience.
Oh, absolutely.
And I think that kind of what you're saying lends itself to what I think most of these issues, whether it be the Matt Mercer effect or any of the other one, boils down to. And it is people and their expectations of the game, as well as, because this can go both ways. We can't forget about that. We can have DMs who suffer the same thing and expect these masterclass levels of RP characters who are full in seriousness and want to get into relationships. So it can go in both directions. And I think most of this generally always starts with, we see it in everything. A fandom can be incredible, but when you idolize or put something on a pedestal like that, whether it be Critical Role or Star Wars or D&D in general, you get this idea that is not only achievable, but what it should be. And most of these issues boil down to having a conversation and be like, guys, I know you love it, but we're not playing Critical Role.
Right.
We're playing D&D.
I want to come back to the example of How do you want to do this? Because that sounds like kind of where this conversation started, at least today. The how do you want to do this, I think, is really important for a lot of players because it is so iconic when people are watching the game. The entire table lights up. When Matt Mercer goes, how do you want to do this? Everyone at the table just explodes with energy and fun, and we're laughing, and somebody gets to sit down and say, okay, I'm a professional voice actor, I'm a professional D&D player, how do I want to do this? And it's really, really cool. And I think we want to emulate that level of fun. I've had an experience, though, where I had a game that I didn't do that. I had a game where I asked a player, I said, hey, how do you want to do this? Or do you want me to paint the picture? And I took a moment and I went over all of my notes. So that campaign, it was a mini campaign with 3 characters. I went through what all 3 of them had done in that last round of combat, and I painted or narrated a picture of how everyone was working together to finish off that final foe. And they loved it. It was one of the reasons that they gave me 5 stars on Start Playing. They were like, hey, this moment that we saw, it was really, really cool because that player gave it back to me to say, hey, how do you want to do this, DM? How do you imagine this happening? No, but I think, we set this tone of, hey, Matt Mercer does this, how do you want to do this thing? We as a Dungeon Master can do something entirely different, but I think that starts with the expectations of our players and maybe even, writing down some of the gripes that we have in the D&D community. One of my biggest gripes with the D&D community as a whole is that it's very, very combat focused, and I'm trying to bring it back to more of a storytelling focus. So when I sit down with my players, I'm going to say, hey, I want to have a story. Combat is an important part of that story, and I will not shy away from that, but here's how I would like to play the game, and I'll get their acceptance of that prior to moving forward. But you're right, the culture has made it so that Mercer is the rule, right? Yes. And we have to separate from that, when in reality, all we're doing is we're coming off of it a little bit back to what the base of the D&D is, and that's creativity.
Or, and I kind of just had this thought to compare it. Like, there's nothing in the rule book about ambiance or setting a scene or playing music, right? But we all now do that, and I'm not sure if people ever have, and that might be a result of watching live plays. Is there at all ever a point in which we kind of conform and just say, hey, this has gotten big enough and enough people like it? There are plenty of things that aren't in the rules that are kind of standard now. Do we now all just kind of grit our teeth and accept it because it has become more culturally known than even some of the rules? Because there's plenty of rules in the rule book that players have no idea about. But if more people know about how do you want to do this, is there a point at DMs as, our responsibility? Hey, it's expected and we take this at this point?
Yeah,
I think
I
yes.
know what you're saying, but then I think with that, I think it starts to get down to then you're managing player expectations. If they're expecting to hear how do you want to do this, now I have a different. I have a catchphrase. I say what's the last thing he sees, as opposed to how do you want to do this, right? It's the same thing, different words. It's very simple.
I just want to point out Dragon Slayer, David, the infinite well of knowledge he is, immediately proved me wrong. He's just like, there was a soundtrack album for 3.5. We did have music. I'm like, okay, cool. Thanks, I'm an idiot. I appreciate it.
Before 3.5.
But before that,
second edition.
I'm scared to speak now. Before there was music, there was Dungeons and Dragons. Right?
I didn't mean to cut you off. He was just...
You're good. I think a lot of it is there now an unfair pressure on any Dungeon Master's experience or thing to manage their expectations of players, where they're expecting music, or they're expecting 1,001 different voices, or they're expecting the how do you want to do this, or they're expecting all the lights, camera, action, and thousands of dollars worth of set production and all this sort of thing that I simply don't have. I'm sitting in my spare room, my phone.
Right. None of us have.
Yeah.
And
I think.
So
one of the commenters, Mac in the Trunk, I think he's a follower on both of our pages, but he mentions here that it is a way for the players to learn their collaborative side of the storytelling, and I think that's very true. And I think so I'm an animal owner. I own a lot of animals, And one of the things that I've learned over the past years is that animals need enrichment. And while this is going to be very reductive to the players, we need to allow enrichment for our players as well, especially in the storytelling aspect. It lets them set the scene, and I think maybe if we were to allow them more storytelling in the rest of the game. How do you want to do this as part of picking a lock? How do you want to do this as part of, doing other skill checks? Maybe there would be a little bit less pressure on us to do that, because that seems like a spotlight. It's a spotlight on the end of combat. How do you want to do this to finish off this last guy? If we can disperse that spotlight over more of the game for the players, maybe they wouldn't need it nearly as much. Maybe that can alleviate it somewhat.
Yeah, that's actually that's really smart to take some of these things that weren't ours and feel like the Matt Mercer effect, and then to say, okay, well, if everybody wants this, I'm going to do it my own way anyway, and then run it, and like you said, turn it into more than just this end calling card for combat, but then use that phrase for the things we want them to describe and to open it up further. I think that's a good idea. I'm probably going to fucking steal that Sunday.
Yeah, so Mac and Chuck, again, how does your magic look? What does picking the lock look like for your character? Okay, you're persuading the shopkeeper, taggle him down. What does that look like? Of course, we can't expect them to be professional actors because we are not professional actors, right? But I think if we can establish some kind of a how do you want to do this outside of combat and give it back to the players, that might give us some of the spotlight back in describing those combat scenarios. Because I'll tell you, I would love to paint the picture more often for the end of combat, what that looks like from the DM's perspective, from, these 5 players working together against this monstrosity. What does that last round of combat look like? The rogue is stabbing, the wizard is fireballing, the barbarian is yelling, right? I want to paint that whole picture, and I think we lose that when it's a singular player, so maybe dispersing out some of that, how do you want to do this into the rest of the game might be a good option to just kind of broaden that enrichment for the players.
Yeah, it would be, and you make a good point, but I was always under the impression that the role as a dungeon master is to try and put as much spotlight back onto the players as possible, because we're not supposed to be there, are we? By the rights, we as a DM are not present in this. I just narrate it. So, as much, again, personally, as much as I can, I hand over creative control back to the players. But again, what's the last thing you see? How do you want to do this? To give them the opportunity to describe how they, like you say, how the wizard's fireballing and the barbarian's yelling at a barrel or whatever he's doing. It hands agency back over to the players the whole time. And that was, again, personally, that's always what I'm trying to do. Any conversation with an NPC, important or otherwise, I do my bit. I do silly voices because I can't do serious ones. Okay, I do terrible impressions of probably borderline racist and some sort. But you know what I mean. But then it's unintentionally, but still. And then so the NPC says this for you, has this information for you. You've asked those questions. Now, what do I say back to them? They say, and then I try and as much as I can hand it back to players. And if you at the end of combat, not that I'm not digging out wall from this, but I think if we as DMs take that sort of joy away from them, that option to describe the entire sea, you're taking the agency away from the players and focusing it back onto the dungeon master, again, for my 2 cents.
No, I love it. I agree with you. I think the point that I'm trying to make is that we can zoom out and narrate the entire thing, right? And say, all right, the rogue decided to do this at the end of combat. The barbarian decided to do that. The wizard decided to do that, and pull that story back together. Because you're right, it's not a spotlight on us. But in what I've found is that it works really well to put the spotlight on the entire team and not necessarily the person that did it. Now, there's always an MVP in a battle, right? That's kind of just how the game goes, and it's fine for that to happen. So I'm with you there.
Yeah.
I'm gonna ask. I'm gonna admit to something and then ask you guys. It's kind of slightly on topic, and it might get me flamed real quick on this conversation of having this feeling that the job is, and it is, to constantly put the spotlight on the players and almost disappear. I do something that is fully antithetical to that, right? Every once in a while, I completely steal the game. Without question. And I do it for like 1 or 2 instances. And I feel like this is going to be like a hot take, but sometimes I will prioritize the story that my players are walking through and telling in order to like build something, some sort of anticipation or something like that for them. And it does. I will cut away and do like stingers or post-session cliffhangers of places and people that the PCs aren't even in the room of. Like a television show, like, oh, combat ended, your story ended, and I will flash cut to a dark room where the BBEG is sitting in a chair and scrying on them or having a conversation.
I do the same thing.
Fully steal the scene from them. Just fully in like my own gluttony, just like, all right, you guys sit and listen to me for a minute. And I've always been like kind of weary to like say that online before getting shredded.
I think there's something to be said about Dungeon Master style when it comes to that, because all of us DM in a different way. I am a narrative storyteller with my DMing. So like I say, in that last round of combat, I'm going to try and paint the whole picture. When combat is over, I want them to see the rest of everything else happening. You know, if my players just killed Strahd, great. They're going to get a cutscene now on what is going to happen to the rest of the countryside now that Strahd is gone, right? So I actually 100% agree with you, and I think there's a time and a place for that. And I think it's important to understand that it's not necessarily me trying to put the spotlight back on me, but it's the spotlight back on the story. We're zooming out from the moment and back to the grand scheme of things.
And it is still kind of on the players, because it is either something that it is going to affect them or it is showing the effects that they have caused. So it is then kind of like the outward look of them and their actions.
And I think part of it too is going to be setting expectations with those players. And Lound Dog, I'm glad you're still here, because you asked a question a few minutes ago that we skipped over about session 0 and if we should do a session 0. I want to hit on that for a second, because he asked if you should do a session 0 to set these expectations, and I think yes. My most recent campaign that I just started this last weekend with my at-home players, we did a session 0, and it lasted like an hour, because I've been playing with them for literal years at this point, and so it was like, hey, this, that, and the other, this, that, and the other. It was really, really fast, but we took a moment to set expectations about what kind of a dungeon master I am, and they know, and we have returned to the fact that I am a storytelling dungeon master. Combat is a story. Skill checks are a story. Interactions are a story. Everything is about the story for me. And if they want it to be focused on something else, they need to voice that. Yep. But what are y'all's feelings on session 0?
Can I just interject, Wolf? No, I'd interrupt you. I'll just go back to that very quick point you made, that Sloan made about sort of cutscenes there, as you say. I understand what you mean by that, and sort of cutting away to show a story beat or something like that. But for me, I'm a bit more of a purist in sense of, if the party are not privy to that information, then they're not privy to that information.
I get it.
One of my players has a familiar who's a bird, literally called Bird. Now, if they were to fly into the room where our BBEG is sitting and then spy and hit, then absolutely, yeah. But I'm more purist in that way. If they're in
I fully get it, and I think
that's how I do it.
Yeah, I think the divide comes from intention, and here's a real big confession, right? I think there are two kinds of enthusiasts. I think there are people that love D&D, and I think there are people that love storytelling and have found D&D to be a great way for that. And that is where I land. So I don't hold D&D in any regard, and I don't really hold any of the rules as holy, and I grew up watching movies, and that's what my goal is. My goal is to have people sit down and have them go through an epic interactive fantasy movie. Whereas I think your goal is, which might be a more honorable one, it might be a better one, but it's all table dependent. I feel like, Joe, your goal is to run a good game of D&D. And honestly, that's never been it is a priority, but just running a great game of D&D has never been my top tier. My top tier was to push it and tell a really interesting story. I would so much be happier if I had a table full of players crying because they felt something than if I had a table full of players cheering because it was a good combat. And that's just where I have always come from.
Yeah, it's a great point, and again, I write my own stories and all that, but it's probably a detriment to myself with that, because there are story beats that the players have missed in the own campaigns I've written, and because I am a purist like that, they never discover that who was the man in the hood and wearing the mask or whatever else.
Right.
I didn't ask the right questions and whatnot. So now that leaves me disappointed because I've written this character and it'd be great and he was whatever, but because they didn't get there, because I didn't do a cutscene or I didn't have that background storytelling to bring them in.
I think that's more authentic to them, though. I think that's more authentic to the players because, like, honestly, there is something a lot to be said of, like, you guys missed it, you missed it. And now this world feels real. Whereas on my end, I'm like, oh, I really want, this is the story that you guys are going through. And, like, I don't want you to miss this because you asked for it and it's a key part of your backstory. So let's explore that. Whereas, and I feel like that might take some of the risk and reward out. It might be its own version of railroading in a certain instance. But I do know that it works for my home table for sure. And then anytime I play with new people, we have a session 0 and we talk. But I definitely reel that stuff back. And I think that's the most important.
I think I'm probably somewhere in the middle there. I'm a really big fan of cutting away into the cutscenes of the pieces of the story that they didn't get, but only in the circumstances that it's important to them, right? It's the cliffhanger. It's the guy standing on a cliff overlooking a town he's about to destroy. It's not the smaller portions of the story. And I'll tell you, in my last campaign, Curse of Strahd, that just finished, there was a ton of the story that they just completely missed out on. And there were plenty of cutscenes that they did see to try and forewarn them, to try and tell them where the story is going next. But I like my players, and I think part of it too is zooming out from just the character's perspective in the game to then those cutscenes are more of the dungeon master talking to the players, not just talking to the characters. Because the characters have no recognition of it, right? But the players might know, oh no, there's a dark shadow. There's something happening, So I probably fall somewhere in the middle because there's lots of stuff that my players miss, and I go, you didn't ask the right questions.
That's sort of the joy. It's great fun at the end of the campaign to go, actually, do you want to know what you missed? Here's what you could have won, and you go through list, of whatever and it's a great. I mean, the guys I'm currently running for, I run the Lost Mines of Fandel the last year for them. It's a great. Essentially, they met Droop. We all know little Droop, but my players stormed into that room, thunder waved. Essentially got a crit and killed Drew before he got to say a single word.
No.
Drew didn't say a single word. He come in, thunder waved, and that was the end of